there's so many different narratives out there that people are shooting out, some of which have no relation to reality, some of which are based partially on reality. You can sort of choose your reality that fits to your social needs. And I became increasingly aware that I was doing that. As the operation in Gaza, which at first I thought was a just operation, then I thought was not a just operation, and then I thought was a war crime, and then I thought was a genocide. Just every month, it just looked worse and worse, and somehow I couldn't keep the cognitive dissonance quiet.
Hello, welcome back to Bogan Intel. Today's guest, Shaiel Ben-Ephraim, is a former IDF intelligence officer who served in the notorious Unit 8200, which has become infamous for its AI targeting lists that it has experimented in Gaza. Shaiel joins us today to talk about the pathologies that exist within Israeli society and the complexities that drive it in its objectives to essentially eradicate Palestinian resistance. Shale gives an in depth breakdown of the historical factors that define Israel's resting state as a nation. We'll look at how the founding fathers put together the state and how its survival has evolved from a more pragmatic nationalist approach to a more messianic religious undertone that now defines Israeli society in the main. Shale also gives a candid description of his experiences working in this quite notorious unit. Please stick around for a really rare insight. Thank you very much for joining us today, Shaiel Ben-Ephraim.
Pleasure. I hope.
Um, we'll see how it goes. Hey, we've got you coming across the Pacific Ocean, our first American guest. So yeah, thanks for coming on. We're trying to tick a few flags off the bucket list. So you're definitely one of them. Thanks.
I'm glad to do it.
We've got you today to essentially talk about some of your work, what you do around essentially researching, commenting, and analyzing Israel and Zionism and the way it intersects with the world around it. So we might get off just to sort of start off a little bit about what Zionism means to Israel today. And I suppose the best way to get there would be to sort of look at how it developed. We see Zionism as a more of having a defensive origins, essentially, where it was about defending a fledgling homeland from invaders or aggressors around it, and then that's kind of somewhat evolved, right? So we've got that kibbutz mentality, but then we have this offensive military strategy now, which now dominates Israeli strategic discussion. So, what are the key turning points do you think in the 20th century that kind of that shifted this outlook?
You actually read my articles about this, like my old scholarly articles about this, or are you just asking about this coincidentally?
No,
I'm just curious.
I've had a bit of a dip.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, because usually people do not read that stuff, so that's why I'm kind of surprised. So, um, yeah, the switch in Zionism from a defensive to offensive orientation was a strong focus of my early research. And let's go back to the beginning, right? Jews didn't have um, sovereignty for a long time, not 3,000 years like you'll often see people tweet, but a good 2,000 years uh, at least. And over that time, they were powerless, at least in the terms of military force. They had political force sometimes, or influence is probably the right word, but not military. So when Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as one of the nationalist movements of the time, um, they didn't really have a military heritage to speak of. And so the Zionist project was based on other advantages, some sway that Zionists had in capitals of countries, the great powers of the time. They spent a lot of time buying land from Arab landowners, not stealing, at least not yet, because they didn't have that kind of power, right? It was the Ottoman era and later the British era, but buying and trying to gain sort of through economic power and institutional power the influence to turn Palestine into a Jewish homeland. But because the disadvantage that Zionists had at the time was a military one, that's one of the reasons that Palestinians, when they were resisting Zionism before 1948, began to use violence. And the emphasis of Zionism started to change. Their early military organizations were called the Haganah, and before that, the Shomer. Shomer is guard, Haganah is defense. And it wasn't just like one of these Orwellian things of calling something defense when it's actually offense. The entire orientation of these organizations was to protect a specific village or a specific agricultural settlement or a specific city. They didn't even have sort of a national command structure or anything like that. That changed during the 1947-48 war, and it changed quite spectacularly. It's actually a pretty amazing story. So in November 1947, the UN decides to partition Palestine to a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's rejected, and a civil war emerges between the two sides. And early on, the Haganah, used to defending specific villages, um, works in that manner. And the Arab militias cleverly realize that the problem that the Haganah has in fighting is that it's not able to defend the communications between Jewish cities and settlements. And it starts to lay siege onto some of the Jewish settlements, the most important one being Jerusalem, on which actually there's severe hunger. There's a siege, not that unlike Gaza. And people try to bring convoys into Jerusalem are slaughtered. The Haganah organizes and realizes that this way they're going to end up losing the war. And they come up with Tochnit Daled, Plan D, and an operation called Operation Nachshon. And the idea is they need to break the road to Jerusalem open, and they also need to prepare the country for a coming invasion of the Arab states. And that means that they want to have their communication lines be safe, and they want the enemy, the Arabs, to not be in threatening positions. So the way the Arab militias were set up at that time, the Arab militias were mostly coming out of villages. They weren't really military formations in the modern sense. They would come down from the villages when there was a convoy going, let's say, into Jerusalem, and they would stop it, right? So in order to defeat these formations, Operation Nachshon was based on going into the towns where those raids were coming out of and destroying them completely. And that's when the Nakba started, right? So the first truly offensive operation of the Haganah in 1947 ended up creating the Nakba. And it's important to note that Palestinian society at that time was very weak. They never really recovered from the rebellion of 1936 to 1939. And it became very clear that these assaults on some of these Palestinian villages were just causing Palestinian society to really crumble. And the sense that, okay, so this part of the war seems to be lost, that started spreading among Palestinians. But once the Arab states come in, then we can start to win, made it easier for a lot of them to leave their homes, hoping that they would come back, and they never did come back. What the Israelis learned from this is that being on the defensive is a recipe for disaster, and that going on the offense is the way that you win wars in the Middle East. And that's something that was certainly confirmed as far as they were concerned by 1956. and to a much greater extent by 1967. And we're seeing a lot of that heritage today, but it's gone completely apeshit, right? And then another element that is subdued in my analysis, which is the rivalry between the revisionist Zionists and the labor Zionists is very important here, because the
Mhm.
people I was talking about up until now who were running the military policy were the labor Zionists, and they believed in static defense, and they believed in defense of agricultural settlements and all that stuff. Meanwhile, their rivals, the revisionists, didn't believe in any of that. They believed in offense. They believed in terrorism. In fact, they introduced terrorism to the area before the Palestinians did, sort of the modern terrorism that we think about with attacks like the King David, and a lot of things that have been forgotten, like bombing, cinemas with children, even in Jerusalem, all kinds of horrible things, bombing buses. And so when the Israelis started going on the offense, because that's what worked better, that also strengthened the revisionists and strengthened their strategic culture, so to speak. And today, the revisionists and their even more insane sort of heirs are running the show.
Mm.
And the fact that they've won politically since 1977 has strengthened that fact. So today we have very little left of that defensive mindset. A lot of it's because it didn't work, and a lot of it's because its champions are no longer politically relevant.
And I suppose you can draw a bit of a line after the Rabin era as well. Like there was a further decline. But I just want to ask you a little bit about these groups to begin with. I mean, they were decentralized groups from what you could sort of say, where they had objectives depending on what village they were or what area they were sort of located in. And then they started to form a more cohesive unit. These groups, which were engaging in asymmetrical warfare against the British, against Palestinian targets and things like that, right?
So no, I wouldn't say that they weren't decentralized in in terms of their strategy towards the British. Uh, it's more complicated than that. So early on, they were indeed very decentralized, but that's mostly because they didn't have a political program against the British.
Yep.
One thing that you have to understand about the relationship between the British and the Zionists is that it took them a very long time to be disillusioned with each other. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was a complicated but ultimately a British statement that we're on your side. We're on the side of the Zionists. And the fact that um, the first commissioner that the British appointed was Herbert Samuel, who was a committed Jewish Zionist, was a strong signal that they were sending to the Yishuv that we're on your side, and a strong statement to the Arabs that we're not. And over time, the British realized that that really doesn't work well. There's fewer Jews than Arabs. And the Arabs, you need their cooperation. You still need Jewish cooperation. They were right about that, but you also need Arab cooperation. And slowly but surely, and 36-39 rebellion really was the turning point here. They realized they can't really fully be on the Jewish side, and they need to do things that the Jews really don't want them to do. They never abandoned the Jews. They never really went against them fully, but they moved away from them enough that a lot of Jews started acting against the British. The Haganah never, at least until 44, never really moved strongly against the British. It was more the IZL and the Stern Gang, the Lehi, that did that. That was one of the major controversies between them. Um, Over time, the decentralized structure of the Haganah became more centralized in order to oppose the Arabs,
Gotcha.
not the British.
Yep.
Right. So in 1920, 21, you have the first Arab attacks against Jews. At that time, most Jews, not all of them, not the most prescient ones, but most Jews thought that it was temporary, that it was going to be cracked down on once the British established order. But once in 29, you had the attacks in Hebron, and elsewhere that were a much, much higher level of violence and very savage, very, very savage. Um, there was an understanding among the Haganah that they needed to have a sort of national strategy against the Arabs. And later on, that also turned into a national strategy against the British. But a lot of what they were doing up until very late was staying out of the way of the British and hoping that the Arabs and the British would become enemies. So they were pretty happy to an extent that in 36, 39, that came true, and unhappy with how it ended, with the British making overtures to try to win the Arabs back onto their side.
Yeah, right. And so these groups here that, essentially made real the revisionists as the number one kind of thinkers in Israel. Were these groups essentially all revisionists to begin with, or were they a mix of pro labor and revisionist, early settlers?
That's a fascinating question, because the Haganah is the labor Zionist movement, and its leadership was labor Zionist and all that. But one of the people who formed it, one of the people who actually formed the Haganah, um, was Zev Jabotinsky, who's the father of revisionism. And
Mm,
some of the other people who formed the Haganah also ended up being revisionist, or they were Labor Party people with very revisionist outlook. So I think the best way to look at the Haganah is the more militarized anti-Arab wing of labor Zionism. Some people wasn't anti-Arab enough, and they left, like Jabotinsky and others, but a lot of them stayed. And the most important among them, by far, is David Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion ended up leading the Haganah de facto, and Ben Gurion was really stood out among labor Zionist leaders in his anti-Arab settlement sentiment, because there were a lot of labor Zionist leaders at that time. I know it seems weird in retrospect, who believed in some sort of political, um, what we call dukiyum in Hebrew. I'm trying to think what the best way of saying that in English is. Kind of a living together, some form of living together, they without violence. There was a lot of labor Zionist leaders who thought that violence was something that you only go to as a last measure. Ben Gurion, who ended up being the first Israeli prime minister, basically the Israeli George Washington, is the best way of understanding it. Ataturk. I don't think people quite understand how important he was, honestly. He really oriented the Haganah on fighting the Arabs over time. He said correctly from his perspective, the British are going to leave eventually. The IZL and the Stern Gang are fighting them anyway. Maybe they'll make that happen quicker. We need to prepare for an eventual war against the Arabs. That was a controversial message among labor Zionists at that time. Less and less controversial over the years, but when he started it, it was very controversial. He wasn't supposed to, by the way, be the guy who led labor Zionism. There was another individual called Arlozorov who was assassinated, and Arlozorov was more diplomatic oriented. Maybe if he hadn't been assassinated, then the movement would have gone in a different direction. It's hard to say, but Ben Gurion was very militaristic and very much facts on the ground kind of guy. So it did have a sort of revisionist edge to it when it started. It cooperated with the revisionists all the time when need be, especially from 1944 to 1948, but it also screwed the revisionists over when it had to. Old school Israeli right wingers will never forget something called the Sezon, which is the Israeli way of butchering the word season, the season of betrayal, when over a few months, the Haganah, in order to get in better with the British and get some benefits from them on immigration, gave the names and addresses of a lot of the leaders of the revisionists, totally screwing them over. Then a few months later, they were cooperating with them in blowing up British facilities. So they were very pragmatic. But out of all the labor Zionists, they were the ones most likely to cooperate with the revisionists. And we really see that in 47, 48, because the Haganah is able not only to cooperate with the Stern Gang and the Lehi, but also to get them within a few months to give up their identity, to give up their independence and join the IDF. And
Wow.
that's actually a very remarkable achievement in retrospect that we take for granted. You know, you look at a lot of post-colonial societies, and they're not able to get all these different militias to disarm and meld into the national armed forces. And the Haganah was able to do that. And it wasn't mostly force, it was mostly diplomacy. And so you're actually hitting on something interesting in your question that I haven't thought about enough, which is that there is a sort of pro-revisionist orientation in the Haganah leadership that allows them to cooperate with the revisionists. I don't think there's been enough study about them.
Well, see, that's a great topic to sort of speak on here because it feels like revisionism was always part of the Israeli early Israeli story. I mean, people talk about Deng Xiaoping in China and how he had his policy of hide and bide, essentially, where he's like, well, we have to hide and bide our strengths. We have to sit away and develop. It seems like Israel, from its inception, was something that could be potentially compromised or changed a little bit over time. It felt like it was a bit of there was a bit like Ben Gurion, for example, was working with so many loose threads from all these different groups, plus trying to appease European powers, the British, Americans. And it feels like it was like whatever it takes was happening a little bit here too. If Israeli society had to appear to be a little bit more of a secular, pro-labor, socialist entity, which many post-war countries had to do, right? I mean, there were many countries, Roosevelt, for example, famously had to ape on to these more socialist ways of doing things out of fear of communism being a more viable alternative. Is there an element that Israel was kind of painting a bit of a picture of what it was to the world? But really, at the end of the day, there are a lot of founding fathers that were revisionists from day one, that were eking towards what we see today. I mean, people talk about, the founding fathers of Israel all being secular atheists, that none of them have these strong sort of ties to, say, what we see today, which is the more messianic Ben Gvir style way of seeing the world. Do you think that there was a little bit of hide and bide going on there in the early founding fathers of Israel? Or was there, just sort of an evolution of thinking and strategy as time went on?
That's a very good question. But I have to unpack something about the right before I answer that.
Totally.
There's an assumption in your question, whether intentional or unintentional, that the right wing, revisionist right wing in the 20s and 30s is a direct line to Ben Gvir and messianic um, settler right wing philosophy that you see today. And the truth is that that's not accurate. That's not true. The revisionists today, sorry, the revisionist forefathers, Jabotinsky and others, would look at Ben Gvir today with absolute horror. And I don't just mean that in the sense of morals or anything like that. It's just a completely different worldview. Um, Jabotinsky and the other early revisionists were secular, at least in political terms, they were secular. They might have had some beliefs or whatever, but they were definitely secular. They were a lot more like 19th century Italian nationalists, pre-fascism.
Garibaldi era style.
Exactly.
Yeah, all right.
Exactly. Garibaldi was Jabotinsky's hero. He loved that stuff. They loved uniforms and marches and parades and flags, but also they believed in, courts and liberal rights. If you read some of the stuff that Jabotinsky and Bogan, by the way, wrote about Arab rights, um, it's pretty shocking. Because they believe in 19th century liberal principles. So they talk about how important it is to treat minorities well, and you don't have any of the messianic stuff. And the reason for the land being for the Jews isn't really tied so much to the Bible. There's just a lot of things that are completely different. There's also an understanding of the Palestinian plight in Jabotinsky if you read his famous Iron Wall essay, for example, he talks about how any people would oppose being colonized. He calls it being colonized by another country. It's completely by another people, and it's completely understandable from their perspective. He says, we just showed up and started colonizing them. Of course, they're gonna fight us, and eventually we have to make peace with them. Then Jabotinsky, by the late 1930s, he was seen as a bit of a dinosaur, and Begin and other people were more extreme than him. But Begin also is a peacenik compared to someone like Ben-Gvir. And Ben-Gvir is the product of a different worldview. So you have the national religious stream of Zionism. At this time, when Jabotinsky was sort of the second strongest stream in Zionism, the national religious stream was very weak, and they were also very moderate relatively to what they are today. But over the years, they became more. But they already believed, and this is the important part, that the right of Jews to the land was biblical, ultimately biblical, and that the most important thing when following Zionism is to follow um, theological commandments over those of the laws of man and the international law and constitutions and all those sorts of things. And that's a huge difference between them and the revisionists. The revisionists believe in all these European ideas, constitutional ideas, that today are completely irrelevant to the Israeli right wing. The national religious view is the one that has won out. It's theological and it's primal.
You have this kind of League of Nations into the UN period of Israel, how it's using the infrastructure of British colonialism as sanitized as it could look as its model, but it's also using these kind of European parliamentary style model. It's using all these things to slap together a country. But I mean, the one thing to the outsiders here, people that are outside of Israel and outside of this project, there is this insistence that Herzl, all of these early Zionists were atheists, were secular, were not religious at all. But the insistence on Israel, on this area, like on Palestine, right? To go into Jerusalem, where the Temple Mount is within eyesight. There has to be something there. It can't just be nostalgia, right? Could there be an underlying pathology within the early Israeli, proto-Israeli society that was playing two cards here? That was wanting to have this modern outlook towards its country, but deep down inside had some form of desire about reestablishing the kingdom of David.
Yeah. So again, great questions. I let me start by saying that there's no real contradiction between the two things that you said, and I know that at first doesn't make much sense, and I'll tell you why. I think there's a difference between believing that God gave you the land and that's sort of a theological commandment, and thinking that Israel is the traditional home of the Jewish people and that we have a strong emotional connection to it. And those are the first statement is something that only certain circles in Zionism would agree with, increasingly wide circles. But at the beginning, they weren't very wide at all, but they existed. And I'll talk about those circles early on in a minute. But the Jews who believe that there's a strong emotional historical tie to the land of Israel is the vast majority of Jews in all periods and in Zionism. So all the secular people that you're talking about, Herzl actually being an exception, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Herzl being an exception, but someone like Ben Gurion is the best example. He would always tell you that the land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people, and he would say that the Bible is a great testament to the antiquity of that link. And I think that is the mainstream Zionist position going back to the early 20th century. And one that I still hold, by the way, even though I don't consider myself much of a Zionist anymore, one that I still hold, that Jews have a strong connection to that land. The question is, Is that an emotional connection, historical connection, or is it because it's ordained by God? And that difference might sound is often an abstract one that doesn't matter much. It sounds like it's theoretical, but it makes a big difference when it comes to things like peace agreements and things like that. Like we will never give back the West Bank, and if someone gives back the West Bank, we'll shoot them. That is a very certain attitude towards Zionism, and that's where those differences are really significant. And I think where you can see this argument most come to the fore early on is a very important moment involving Herzl. When Herzl gets an offer from, I think, from Joseph Chamberlain to form a Jewish state in Uganda instead of in Palestine, he says, listen, we have this place, Uganda. We want to turn it into one of our thriving British, imperial places, but we need white people because only white people can build a state properly. Why don't we send you and your friends to Uganda? We'll give you guns, we'll give you money, and you can form the Jewish state there. At that time, the British didn't run Palestine, so it wasn't like they weren't offering so much instead of Palestine, but this was part of the empire. Herzl thinks this is a good idea. He's like, well, Uganda has some diseases and so on and so forth, but I'm sure we can manage. And then he brings it to the Zionist conference, and he's jeered at. Things are thrown at him. People are incredibly mad at him. A lot of those people are religious. They're not exactly what we would identify later as sort of religious Zionists, because that ideology hadn't crystallized, but they were maybe the genesis of that. And there were a lot of Jews who were secular, who had a very strong feeling that if it's not Palestine, then it's pointless because of the emotional and historical connection to it. And then you had people who were anything in the middle, who had some religious affiliation, and so on and so forth. So when you're hearing people say that all the early Zionist leaders are secular and atheist, that's not true. Herzl was an atheist, but Herzl was a weirdo. Herzl was a weirdo. He doesn't really represent the mainstream of Zionism in any way. He was like a visionary kind of guy. Um, and had all sorts of, he was emotionally unstable in various ways, had a lot of personal problems, but he was also very charismatic guy, very good looking guy. And he had ideas that were very unacceptable to most Zionists. And under pressure, he would back down on them. He doesn't represent the hardcore. The normal Zionist, the average Zionist, is someone who maybe, I'm talking about like up until the creation of the state of Israel. After that, things changed somewhat. Is someone who believes in God, believes in the link of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, historical and emotional, but ultimately believes that God doesn't determine what happens; human beings do, and that we need to be pragmatic about how we create this state, how we create its institutions, and that the way forward is to be part of the sort of enlightened West and not to be a very religious state, and certainly not to take influences from the Arabs and people like that. And what you're hinting at with some of the things that you're saying is that this is an act, but it's not an act. It's you have people who come from societies where they look to the West as superior, and that's
Mhm.
part of the colonization thesis. They're not of the region. The Jews who are of the region are a minority, and they're relegated to non-leadership roles when they are part of the movement. They're told that the Western ways of doing things are superior. Every kind of institution they create is Western in its orientation. Those institutions win over the Palestinian ones, which only confirms to them their sense that the Western way of doing things is superior.
Because
Um,
they were cutting edge, tried and tested colonial models, right? That were being implemented.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly. But they believed in them, so they're not pretending to be something they're not. Ehud Barak, very late in Israel's history, said that Israel is a villa in the jungle. It's a beautiful house in the middle in a terrible neighborhood, and that's how Israelis see themselves, or at least did until recently. And that's sort of the labor Zionist way of looking at things.
Getting back to what we're talking about, the shift from this kind of secular nationalism to more messianic religious nationalism. So if we can say the King David Hotel was like the peak of the bombing, there was the peak of that nationalism, of that nationalist movement sort of flexing its muscles there. Could we say that the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre was the beginning of the religious era, sort of starting to win this battle?
The real turning point, the most important turning point, is 1967. 1967 is a massively important turning point for a few reasons. The most important reason is that Israel takes over the land that is at the heart of the theological argument for Israel. One thing that people sometimes forget about Israel early on, 1948 to 1967, is that none of the really holy sites for Judaism were under Israel's rule. Uh, the Wailing Wall, the Cave of the Patriarchs, Hebron, all these places that are in the Bible, the important places that are in the Bible, of course, lots of places in Israel proper were in the Bible, were under Jordanian rule. And one of the reasons for that, by the way, is because Ben Gurion preferred to take over Eilat to taking over the West Bank. He had those options. Where should we send our forces? To take over Eilat or take over the West Bank? And he said Eilat. Why? Because Eilat will give us a place so we can get oil
Red Sea port, yeah.
uh, from the south. Yeah, so he preferred that to that tells you a lot about Ben Gurion's priorities.
And the canal lives in his memory now to try and reinforce that, right?
Exactly. Yeah, he also had all these theories. He would use the Bible for his stuff. He would say in the Bible it says there's Sinai was ours, and it said this little island in the Tiran Straits that's in the Bible. Meanwhile Hebron and Jerusalem are in every line, but that's not what he wanted to conquer, so he didn't talk about it. Some of his generals thought that was insane, that he should have gone for the West Bank. So there was a lot of pushback, but that tells you something about Ben Gurion. So Israel didn't have these areas. So it takes over these areas in 67. It takes them over in 6 days, which is a biblically symbolic amount of days. God created the world in 6 days. That's important to a lot of Jews. And it does it. And another thing that a lot of non-Israelis aren't very aware of is that before 67, Israelis were sure that the country was about to be destroyed. So if you talk to the old folks who were around then, they tell you how before the war started, they would go into the parks and they would dig up mass grave, like areas for mass graves, because they thought that the Arabs were going to kill everyone because Nasser had closed down the straits, and the Jordanians and the Syrians had signed pacts with him, and they thought that that was going to be it. They were going to lose. And when Israel won the war in 6 days, that seemed miraculous to a lot of people. And then they
But
were reunited with the Wailing Wall. Um, it created a messianic fervor in Israel. The country never really recovered from. Uh, and that spread the national religious, who were a weak, small movement, over time became very assertive, very right wing. They said, look, this is what we've been telling you all the time. We're all here because of God. Everything that you're doing, all your little games, your human games, are because God allows you to have them. And we have to serve God. And the most important thing in Israel is to safeguard these holy sites, because that's what matters about Israel. And a lot of secular people agree with him now. They're like, I mean,
driven
yeah,
by
look
fear,
at what happened.
driven by fear. I mean, as you say, 1967 was such a big amassing of every contiguous neighbor was in on it.
But 67 was one for various reasons. The Israelis had a very, very good military plan. The Arab countries were disunited. Basically, the more Arab countries are involved in wars, the worse it gets for them because they don't cooperate very well. One of the things about 73 is that the Egyptians planned the war as if there were no other Arab countries. They were like, we've learned that we can't rely on any of the other ones, so we have a completely self-contained strategy, and that worked much better.
Mhm.
And there were political weaknesses for those countries. There's a lot of reasons that happened. But the most important is the surprise strike that Israel managed to pull off that gave it air superiority at a time when air superiority was the only thing that mattered on the battlefield.
This is a fascinating period, 1967 more broadly. I mean, you speak about Nasser, his time was numbered, after 1967. The whole region started shifting dramatically after that period as well. And coincidentally, so too did the nature of the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv, right? There was a change from that lobbying era that sort of probably went up through to Jimmy Carter, but could have ended up in the end of Richard Nixon as well, that turned into, something else. Hello. If you're enjoying this kind of perspective from someone like Shale and other unique perspectives with some historical deep dives and some big picture analysis, please like and subscribe this channel on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, as doing this alone helps to propel and boost our small little channel to a wider audience abroad. We really want to get in more perspectives like Shale over time, and your support means so much. So thank you. And I do want to ask you, was this new religious way of looking at survival in Israel? Did that also transfer to the U.S. relationship as well? And the way the U.S. saw the region and the existential threats towards Israel and its interests in the region, were they somewhat influenced by this kind of thinking as well, without even knowing potentially?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. So the yeah the we think today of the relationship between Israel and the United States as the very close alliance that later emerged, the one that's kind of fraying now, but that incredibly close alliance. But to a great extent, as you hinted in your question, that alliance was cemented by 1967. The best way to understand the love affair that emerged between Israel and the United States after 1967 is by understanding that it was kind of a repressed love affair until that moment. Michael Oren, who later on became like this cheap politician, but he's one of the great historians of the Middle East, wrote an amazing book about the relationship between the United States and Israel and how it developed over time. And he's talking about, from the Pilgrims on, not the modern stuff. And basically, what he shows there is how this orientation towards biblical stories and the idea of the Americans as the new Israelites and the new chosen people and manifest destiny as a biblical ordinance of sorts created deep identification with the Jewish people. That also comes from this Protestant idea of reading the Bible directly, that gives you access to the stories of the Old Testament and all that. So if you look at early American cities, they were usually named after either Greek cities or cities from the Bible. And you have this very strong affinity. And you have Zionism emerging, and there's been more attention on this recently, first in Britain and in America before Jews started to be Zionists. And Jews were very distrustful of this because they saw it as some kind of way to kick out the Jews. Like, yeah, you want us to go to our Holy Land so you can get us out of New York and London. Like, we're not buying this. That was the early Jewish reaction to Zionism. So when Israel was formed in 1948, Americans were very supportive of Israel, and there were fundraisers, and there were op-eds and demonstrations, and people raising money, and sending weapons, everything to Israel. But the American government wasn't willing to go full in because the State Department people, the military was telling them, listen, Israel is weak. The Arabs are going to defeat it at some point. And even if they don't, we need the Arabs more than we need Israel in order to contain the Soviet Union. We need their oil in order to fight the Cold War. Basically, as much as we want to support Israel, it's a dumb thing to do. So generally, they either were neutral or even supported the Arabs on some things, like in 56, when Israel invaded Sinai, they went full in to support Nasser, which they ended up regretting.
1967 period is so important. And, I've spoken about this in other ways too. After 1967 is the beginning of the neoconservative era of geopolitics, which seems to align a lot with Israel's objectives in the region as well. I mean, the neocon wars have been fought majority like majority of them have been fought in the contiguous neighbors of Israel, within the Middle East. And the whole tail wagging the dog thing that comes in every now and then, has to be considered somewhat when you see the geopolitical decisions regarding its conflict, its conquest, and its war that America has chosen in the region. I mean, so many of them, even Iraq has been pushed by Netanyahu. The intentions with Syria, with David's corridor, with things like that. These have been long-term geopolitical objectives of Israel, and they also have fallen into America's domain. So even looking at Iran, for example, whenever America checks its papers, it goes, "Wait a sec, Iran's not in our interest to attack." But it just falls back into Israel's view on Iran every now and then all of a sudden, we're striking Fordo. So I just find that interesting. It's more of a note and a comment that this whole geopolitical era has also happened in this in the religious nutbags taking over era of Israel as well. And look, I just want to get back to that as well. Now, this religious nutbag era, the messianic or the biblical delineations of what Israel was. When you see Isaiah, is it Isaiah who went up to, overlooked Damascus and said, one day Damascus is going to burn. You see Mount Hermon, for example, which has been captured as a strategic position. But underneath, there's like Rabbi Indiana Jones types, like looking for Nephilim in the ground and things like that. There's genetically engineered red heifers that are in storage. There's a priest class that has never walked on ground that is sitting on floating nets somewhere inside Israel, ready to sacrifice these red heifers. You have a whole bunch of, crazies going to the Temple Mount now, including Ben Gvir, and uttering, chants and all sorts of things, talking about the third temple, AI gifs of the temple being rebuilt over Alaska Mosque. And yeah, like we also go into the dominance of these, religious messages now in proper Israeli life. Netanyahu famously saying Amalek to the people of Gaza and letting the IDF go in there, essentially pasting Noahide law up on the walls of Gaza. So, I mean, this is mind bending to me as someone who's followed these religious, developments, and I'm wondering how this is affecting Israeli society in the main, but also how much of this is dominating the geopolitics. I mean, I look at the realist geopolitics of situations of flashpoints in the world, and you can see things with that toolkit. But with Israel, it's very hard to understand what they're trying to achieve with that toolkit. But when you apply the lens of messianic geopolitics, it can make a bit of sense. So I want to ask you a little bit how you feel this is playing into Israel, the modern Israel right now, and how its actual strategic outlook is being informed by this messianic outlook.
Oof. Yeah, good question. So, yeah, as I said, from 67 onwards, there's an increased influence of these elements that have always existed on the actual strategy. And in the 1970s, you really see it out in the open. You have settlers um, setting up settlements in areas that the government doesn't want them to settle in and insisting on staying there, and sometimes managing to bend the government's knee and force them, quote unquote, with allies always in the government, and this is an important point, to accept it. At that point, they were the weaker side, but they were starting to influence the policy of the government. Over the years, demographically, they've become a larger part of society. I remember when I worked for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, going into the office of someone who had cleared out, and they had I still don't know who it was, but someone who had cleared out, and they had a poster of the third temple over the walls of the over the Wailing Wall with El Aqsa obliterated, right? And they had that poster in their office. And at that time, this is a long time ago, it was like early 2000s. I was shocked. I was shocked, that this would be in the government office. Today, you would not be shocked. But that already shows you that some of these people were already making policy. And this was at the foreign ministry, which is like the more dovish, still, the more dovish element of the Israeli government, if there still is a war dovish element. At that
Compared
point, it
to the
definitely
Interior Ministry. Yeah, yeah, I gotcha.
exactly, exactly. Um, now the messianic elements are in the government. They're not just in the government; they're in the government with veto power. And anyone who looks at the Israeli government today from a realist lens has, like you said, has no idea what Israel's doing. It makes no sense, especially things like Syria, things like that make absolutely no sense. But if you understand the powers that are at play within the government, it does make sense. What you have is you have three different concerns that are expressed in the government. One is the ultra orthodox, and they have their own thing. It doesn't come out much in foreign policy. Then you have Netanyahu, who wants to stay in power and has realized that if there's a constant crisis, but a crisis that he can sort of resolve, that keeps him in power and raises him in the polls. So, Trump likes to create crises he can't resolve. Netanyahu always create crises that he can resolve, or at least appear to have resolved. And then you have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who have a veto over everything, who are running exactly that messianic playbook that you're talking about. A playbook that Netanyahu is fully willing to placate, um, as long as it keeps him in power, and may or may not at this point support. I mean, what if you follow Netanyahu for a long time? You know that early on he was a pragmatist on foreign policy, and nowadays when he does things that are completely unpragmatic, it really becomes a question of, is he still a pragmatist deep inside, or has he bought some of the messianic stuff? And his family may have influenced him to become more messianic.
And I'll never forget that meeting he had with Schneerson, Rebbe Schneerson, back in the, I think it was the early 90s or something like that, where he essentially, he promised the Rebbe he was going to do this. So yeah, there's that contradiction at play again, right?
Yeah. Did he promise them that because that's the right thing to say? Or did he promise them because he believes it, or somewhere in between? It's
He's
very
got a
hard to know.
is he messianic? Does he have a messianic complex as well, right? Just like the Rebbe.
I think the longer he is in power, the less rational he is. And it wouldn't surprise me if he's also taken on some of these crazy ideas too. But it's
Mhm.
very hard to tell because Netanyahu will whore himself out to any interest that will keep him in power. So it's very hard to know what he actually believes, if he believes in anything. That's the problem with him. But Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, if anyone had any doubts that they're just talk, I think that their policy has completely disproved it. They're true believers, both of them, and they're pushing this as far as it can go, and they're taking an increasingly large amount of Israelis with them, into this point of view, and I think a lot of Israelis feel, um, and always have felt, that the world is going to hate Israel no matter what it does, and that Israel's existence is a miracle, and that comes from God, and what matters is the commandments of God, and not what the world says, and not what the world does, and that leads to increasingly illogical policy. A lot of people support, and the people who are against it are increasingly marginalized, demonized, aren't reproducing at the same levels, and like myself, are leaving. Everyone, I don't want to exaggerate. Not everyone I know, but a lot of the people I know who are still there are either making plans to leave or wish they could leave. Um, there really aren't a lot of moderate people who see a future there. And for people like myself, who believed in that more moderate Israel of the past, it becomes very difficult. Some people start feeling, oh, we lost our country, which is something that I felt for a while. In my case, I've also gone back and said, well, maybe the country never was what I thought it was, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. But there are very few sort of secular, moderate, rational Israelis who feel comfortable with what Israel's become. Not everyone's messianic necessarily, but the vast majority are very much believe in violence, very much believe in racism, and the messianic element has always had that advantage that it's the most committed to its goals, and so it makes allies with other people, and it pushes and it pushes, and it manages to get things done. And every year it becomes a little bit easier because demographically the circles that support it are larger.
It's hard to salt the earth without a little bit of blessing from God. You know what I mean? It just makes it a little bit easier when you got that blessing from God. You can salt the earth with a little bit less stress. Now, it's very interesting, this red heifer era, because it's there, and it's just batshit crazy, and it feels like a Jonestown with nukes scenario sometimes, when you see that Netanyahu's actually the moderate now. The person who killed the left in Israel is now the moderate position, compared to these other guys. The brain drain and the exodus of moderates like yourself is now pretty much complete. If it hadn't happened before October 7, it has happened now. I mean, I don't know how many people are leaving a month, but I just saw in Portugal a massive lineup of people looking to seek citizenship there, in Cyprus, wherever it can happen. So now to you. Were you born in Israel?
Yeah, I was born in Jerusalem. I don't have an accent because my parents are from New York, so not very indigenous. But yeah, I was born and raised in Jerusalem. Lived there until I was I don't know, 30.
Yeah,
So
wow.
yeah, pretty Israeli. Yeah.
Okay, now I'd like to sort of speak a little bit about yourself here. It might get a tiny bit uncomfortable, but you're a good bloke now, and it's good to have a chat. Essentially, you served in the IDF military intelligence wing, which is, essentially quite notorious. People might know that Unit 8200, I think, that has, a global reputation these days, and what it does. And you were actually working in the area of target acquisition, right? From my reading.
Yeah, yeah. Late in my service, that's what I was doing.
Yeah,
Or
wow.
to be I'm happy to say that I was involved in what not to target rather than what to target, which meant that I could sleep better at night. I was mapping out a lot of the infrastructure. I was mapping out a lot of where there were hospitals and houses and things like that. I wasn't the one who, because of my uh, at that time bad and now almost non-existent Arabic, I wasn't the one who was tracing suspects. Of course, I knew the people who were, and we worked with them. So I didn't give the orders to kill anyone, or gather the intelligence to kill anyone, which helps me sleep at night.
But
But I
it
was
was your
involved in a lot of things.
it was your prudent GIS mapping that was making it easier for the people who needed to kill people, right? To find who they needed to kill.
No, no, I didn't map anything. I gathered intelligence through conventional. This is a long time ago. This is 20 years ago. No, yeah, it's more than 20 years ago. So I was going over a lot of written material and things like that. But certainly I was involved. I'm culpable for all kinds of things I don't even know I'm culpable for. You know what I mean? Operations were happening that I was part of without me knowing that I was part of them.
And did you have, like many Israelis that we see today, a zeal towards your work, a zeal towards what you were doing for your country, what you were doing for the Zionist entity?
Yes. So when I was coming up, it was the Second Intifada. And in the Second Intifada, we were 100% sure that we were the good guys fighting against a wave of terrorism. I guess like not that different from today. But because the Second Intifada was not as, from the Israeli perspective, not quite as savage as October 7th, we didn't suffer the same amounts of casualties. And our response wasn't as quite as savage, still pretty savage. Uh, Back then, I think when look at the fervor, the violent fervor that's in the IDF today from the outside, I don't recognize it from the IDF from my time. It was a lot more under control. It was a lot more. There was
Professional.
professional. Professional is a very good term for it. Yeah. We were very concerned. This is going to sound weird to your listeners. We were very concerned about international law. We were very concerned about Israel's image abroad. We were very concerned about the ramifications, in security terms, of what happens if we hit the wrong target, in terms of stirring up more opposition and support for terrorist organizations. There was just a lot of um, scientific almost talk about what it takes to lower the flames in the Second Intifada rather than raise the flames. Um, you certainly knew, there's tension between intelligence and the people who are on the ground, the grunts. The grunts, think that we don't know what's going on. They're, to some extent, they're right. We think that they're kind of bloodthirsty, and they're not selecting targets properly and not following international law properly. And there's a sort of tension there. So we knew that the soldiers on the ground could be very trigger happy and could be committing war crimes, and that was something that we and the people in the advocacy, the lawyers, wanted to hopefully prevent. So all the bad tendencies that you see in the IDF today, they were there, but there were systems that tried to keep them under control. But in retrospect, that's impossible to sustain,
That's right.
because what I didn't fully understand at the time, I did understand to some extent at the time. I wasn't dumb. Was that the entire system is set up to oppress the Palestinians. Now, at that time, we had these other considerations of thinking if we oppress them too much, that's bad. But that was for strategic reasons, right? The idea
Right.
is to oppress them as much as possible.
For public
So they put
relations
you in
reasons too.
this
Yeah.
public relations and strategic. So we thought that goes hand in hand. Basically what I defended Israel until very recently, because what I was taught when I was in the army and what I was taught when I was a kid is it's not good for Israel to kill civilians. That's what I was always told. We shouldn't be killing civilians. It's not good. It's not moral, and it's not good for us. It's not good for them. It's not good for anyone. So why would we do it? And I firmly believe that people in the army were still following that logic many years later. But ultimately, the only logic that underlies the operations is the logic of victory and oppression, which is something that I guess I didn't fully understand the ramifications of at the time. Basically, if you build a system that's completely designed to oppress other people, you can't really control it in the long term. It's self-corrupting.
And intelligence can work as a limiter. So, as you said, you were helping trigger happy IDF soldiers, or you thought you were, to stop killing so much. But then it can also become a multiplier because then your units start telling the soldiers they're not killing enough and start giving them information of more people to kill at a rapid rate. And we saw your unit. Were you in 8200, by the way?
It was.
There we go. I mean, like your unit has, become immortalized in its depravity. Via its AI target acquisition era. Lavender, for example. Were you around during that period where AI target acquisition was starting to be entertained, or automatic
No,
generation of kill lists and things
AI
like that?
was AI was science fiction. Was science fiction at that time.
But
AI was
something
fiction.
a proto version of that, like a way of being able to use data sets to rapidly create kill lists.
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course. But that wasn't my department. But yeah. You would have what became AI in the sense of, so you had a model of um, where targets would be, how targets would be set up, and you would extrapolate that to areas where you didn't have enough information. So you would try to turn an unknown into a known with information that you didn't really have, which technically is a war crime if you act upon it. I mean, just having that information is not a war crime. But if you act upon it as if it allows you to differentiate between civilian targets and military targets, then you're actually not doing distinction in any proper sense. And the way I interpret it, the use of AI models and the use of extrapolating unknown information, it's very similar to just bombing blind in moral and legal terms, as far as I'm
It's
concerned.
very Amalek. It's just an Amalek way of doing things. You don't have to worry so much when there's an Amalek objective in front of you, right?
Yeah. I think a lot of the dehumanization that Palestinians have undergone for Israelis was just much less developed then. I have to say that among my colleagues and myself, I think we did see Palestinians as human beings, and we regretted when civilians were killed. And I think we lost that at some point. We never regretted it enough, and we set up systems that would kill them, but something was lost along the way. But I think it was inevitable that would happen. If you go back to the beginning of the occupation, we talked about 67. The person who set up the occupation was Moshe Dayan, and Dayan, his dream was to have the most enlightened occupation known to man. He wanted never to see the Palestinians had never seen Israeli flag. He wanted Palestinians to never seen Israeli soldiers, never feel like they're being oppressed. And he tried to build the occupation that way. And he would travel the West Bank and go to weddings and make personal connections. And you can't keep those things up. Basically, every generation got worse. Every generation got worse, but the seeds of the crimes were in the conception.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can gild an all-encompassing intelligence apparatus. There's only so much gold leaf you can paint on this thing before it is just what it is. A cage on a barrel full of fish. So look at this unit here. Which automatically generates kill lists. Domestically has been such a massive influence over the way Israel sees it, the way it exercises its tradecraft now, strategically and militarily, and it almost seems like the tip of the spear, somewhat. I mean, we saw with Iran and things like that how important 8200 was in some of those espionage operations and things like that. Now, I want to ask you: is there a transnational aspect to 8200 that acts like Mossad, for example, that looks to deploy some of these strategies overseas?
Certainly not when I was there. The A200 was involved only in areas where the IDF was either deployed or had a strong potential of being deployed. So I never saw anyone working outside of the zones of operation, which at that time already included Iran, but don't include Morocco, don't include Paris, don't include anything like that at the time. There's no moral reason from the Israeli perspective why they wouldn't. The only reason there wouldn't be is because of turf wars between the Mossad and Amman with the military intelligence, which controls 8200. I can imagine the Mossad not wanting them to be involved, and just for reasons of efficiency. Now, 8200, the way it really becomes international, very international, is that its graduates are sought out all around the world, and its graduates are sent by Israel to places around the world, and their skill set and their connections are intentionally internationalized. So that's why I'm saying it's not, it is international um, in terms of its actual effect in the world. You have 8200 people who are working in for other governments, who are working for international organizations, for big corporations like Microsoft and others, very intentionally to help Israel further its agenda there. So the alumni are used internationally in that regard.
And how
Unfortunately for
many
me, that was
how many
mostly
are like
after my time.
yourself? Yeah, how many are like yourself? Reformed 8200s are there out there?
There's very few like me who are public. There's a lot of people who are like me who are private. There's so the army has two traditionally uh, two traditionally more left-wing bastions, and that's intelligence and that's the Air Force. And strangely enough, they're also involved in killing the most Palestinians, right? There's a strong paradox there. There's something Israelis call yorim v'bochim, that means shooting and crying. That those units are known for, like feeling very bad about the things that they did, is a very important part of the tradition of those parts of the IDF. A
Shooting
lot of the
and
people in
crying.
those shooting and crying. We say it as sarcastically as it sounds to you. Like, we don't say it as a compliment. We say it as like, okay, you killed a bunch of people, now you're whining about it. It's not said in a nice way. Right wingers say it about left wingers to embarrass us, and they have a point. So um, when I was in intelligence, I was not one of the more left wing people. I was moderate. There were a lot of people who were very uncomfortable with what they were doing, and I thought a lot of them were wusses. To be honest, I disagreed with them. I thought we were fighting against terrorism, and what we were doing was important. And so a lot of people were already way to the left of me. Some of them joined organizations later on, like B'Tselem and others. But most of them, the people who were like that, just kind of faded into the background. A lot of them live in other countries without speaking. That's the most common thing. There's a big price to speaking out. Not so big that people shouldn't do it. As someone who's experienced a lot of it, like, whatever. So people say nasty things to me, big deal. But you lose friends, you lose family members. A lot of people don't want to do that. So no, there aren't a lot like me. And then there's the other people who have more of them who become part of the network and continue to cause damage in other ways, even while being smart enough to know why what they're doing is wrong. There's true believers who continue to serve Israel to the day they die, and then there's a lot of mercenaries.
You were a young fella. You lasted 30 years in Israel as a
And I didn't
zealot.
leave over ideology. I
Yeah.
didn't leave. Today I would leave over ideology, but I didn't leave over. I don't want to pretend that I did anything I didn't do.
So
Yeah.
that's it. Like, I mean, this is a society that uses fear and indoctrination on people like yourself. You were a young kid that was raised up to believe that what you were doing was, if not God's work, it was the duty for your nation that that you were
I mean,
born to do.
the main agent for Zionism in my life was my mother, more than the government, more than anyone else. My mother was, God rest her soul, but she was a fanatic Zionist to the point where it was like her entire identity. We get this with our mother's milk. She left a very comfortable life in Queens to come to Israel, and she never regretted it. She loved Israel with all her heart. Yeah.
So but that's what I'm saying. It's
Get it
like
from
these
your mother?
victim,
This is not your
there's these
homeland.
toy
It's the
villages
Jewish
being
homeland.
established with
And like
quite wealthy,
one
unpersecuted people
day
from Queens and
it's all
things like
going to be
that
ours.
that just
And
have
the Arabs
chips on
know
their
that.
shoulder and raise children in these cauldrons, in these environments. I just saw some footage the other day of Smotrich walking into a classroom and, the girl screaming like he was Justin Bieber. What the heck is gripping a society where a crusty old salt and peppered politician can get this kind of reaction out of a young people? And this is a politician he's not that graceful. He's not a great orator. He's just a batshit maniac that's kind of harping on about end days. And is it fear? Like, is there a fear that was always in the back of your mind when you were encouraged to behave in this kind of zealous, this over the top way of appraising your country? Did you ever feel like scared were there thoughts that were coming into your head, rational thoughts that just come out of being a half intelligent human being that you were always conflicting with? And I want to ask you, as someone that lives there, is there a contradiction? Is there a Jekyll and Hyde? Is there something within every Israeli where they know deep down inside there's something not quite right? Or has the propaganda fully washed over the society in a way where you have this child soldier kind of way of indoctrination that we see in a developing world that really just sweeps through the neurons and like the brain chemistry of a child to a point where it's almost irreversible?
Yes. You ask the tough questions. I grew up in a liberal neighborhood in Jerusalem. We were always encouraged and told that peace will come. Maybe one day we won't have to go to the army. Arabs are people just like us. They took us to like an Arab school and they said, play nice with them. And if someone, said something nasty, it would be taken aside sternly. Like we were raised that peace is possible, and we were told that the reason there's no peace is because of the Arabs. Uh, th- we didn't grow up feeling that we were in a militarized society, but we were constantly being groomed to go into the army in various ways. We were always told that we have no choice. En brera is what we call in Hebrew, no choice. There's no choice. You have to fight. And to us, we were on Rabin's side in the 90s, and we were shocked when he was assassinated. We lived in an Israel that was very different. And the other Israel existed, and we saw it, and we were scared of it. We knew it was there, and we were scared of it. I remember that when Robin was assassinated, I went to a friend. I was still a kid. I was taking the bus, and I went through this religious neighborhood, and there was graffiti there of like Robin's a traitor, Robin must die, and that he'd just been killed. And I realized I'd never really noticed that graffiti before. It didn't really mean much to me before. It was just part of the background, you know. And today Israel's really become only that, or increasingly that. So you always had those two sides. Um, I think that there's a lot of lack of confidence in Israelis about the direction they've gone. And when you say, do you think that there's a voice in the back of the head of the average Israeli? I think that there really is. There really is. And I've served a little bit as a confessor to Israelis recently. Like, I get contacted by Israelis that I know and that I don't know with like their doubts, including people who vote right, people who vote center, not the messianic nut jobs. And basically, what they're asking me is like, "Are we the baddies?" Like that meme. Are
Yeah.
And deep down inside, they know. They know. But there's so much social pressure not to voice it, and there's rationalization, and there's to what extent are we the baddies, and whose fault is it, and there's all these rationalizations. But the average Israeli is very aware that something has gone wrong with the soul of Israel. They feel it internally in ways that the compassion and social cohesion that Jews used to have towards each other, that kept Israel going. They never had it towards Arabs in any meaningful way, but that they had towards each other, that also tempered to some extent the way that they treated Palestinians, is gone from social interaction.
Including the link to American Jews, which was very important with that kind of relationship too back at home, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there was always tensions. There was always tensions, like, they don't understand us. They sit pampered in their homes and expect us to make peace with these monsters and whatever. But now it's very out in the open. And by the way, it's had a lot of effect on the American Jews too, who are scared of the Israelis and try to show that they're more Zionist than they are. It works in both ways. But yeah, like, the way people talk to each other, the way people communicate, the way the political atmosphere, it's not that different from in America. I don't know how it is in Australia, but in America, with the way MAGA has poisoned the wells here and the way everyone talks to everyone, it's like that, but worse, because it's in the middle of a genocide, and also the heat doesn't help anything. And people are just really nasty to each other. And people take that nastiness into the territories, into Gaza, into the West Bank, and take it out. And everyone knows that it's related. Everyone knows that whatever was good in Israeli society, even internally, is going away. And even the right wingers are aware that the binds that keep Israelis together are fraying, and they have a lot of movements to try to, they call it, like, to repair the cracks in Israeli society. There's definitely a deep feeling in Israel, like there is in just about every other Western democracy where I talk to people nowadays, that something's going horribly wrong. But in Israel, people are also aware that they don't have the margin of error that other countries have, and that could lead to Israel's destruction. And but that's not necessarily a good thing, because that taps into the existential Jewish fear of destruction, which is at the heart of Israeli violence. And I
That's
think this is an
right.
important point you're probably aware of. But I personally believe that insecurity and fear is behind a lot of human violent behavior. I see that in Russia. I spent some time in Russia. They had this um, fear of being invaded from the West that leads to a lot of the crazy shit that they do in Ukraine and in other countries.
Sure. Look at North
And
Korea. Look at a lot of countries that are dominated by fear.
exactly, and
And the only
Israel's like that.
Yeah, and the only thing that keeps a society that's bound by fear together is some kind of common like understanding or acceptance of a legitimacy of the power that's holding it together. And right now, with Netanyahu's issues domestically, he's essentially a criminal, and he's running a criminal cabinet. And Israeli society, just on that alone, even though 60+% of them want more, killing done in Gaza, 60+% of them want Iran to be, overthrown and invaded. It seems to be when the smoke settles a little bit, when you think about things a little bit in Israeli society, there's a big juxtaposition between these kind of big acts that are designed to try to preserve the Jewish state and also the realities on the ground, which are seeing it tear apart due to those actions. I mean, maybe stopping a genocide and 7 contiguous wars could potentially, allow a bit of breathing room for all those things you mentioned to be considered, and for maybe the adults in the room to start thinking about them. But just bang, there's another missile attack. Bang, there's another, incursion into southern Lebanon, and the whole thing goes to shit again. I want to ask you though, essentially you were involved in the most notorious group of military attachment, in the modern 21st century almost. There are, you
I
could
never really
make.
thought of it that way. I know they're notorious, but I never thought of it as that notorious.
Oh, look
All
from
right,
from the
I
outside,
know. Yeah.
looking at it, you'd look at some of those like incredibly notorious, the NKVD, you'd look at the Gestapo, you'd look at these sort of groups, and then see the more nuanced groups that are involved around intelligence and what intelligence did to those, barbaric entities throughout history. So I do have to ask you, mate. You've come a long way to come to where you are now. And I mean, it was this year that you changed your position essentially from a Zionist to an anti-Zionist, right? So I'm not going to say, as we say in Australia, you were dragged kicking and screaming to that point. But I have to ask you though. Firstly, what regrets linger from your time working for the most notorious military attachment in the modern era?
Well, I mean, if it was up to me now, I would just not serve in the IDF. I regret ever serving at this point. Um, I think that the IDF is an instrument of oppression of a state that shouldn't exist in its format. And yeah, it takes kids and turns them into war criminals. It was doing that then, and it's doing that now. Um, I can't say that I regret some specific terrible war crime that I committed because I didn't, and I don't think I was. I don't. There's nothing I look at in my service and I'm like, this was a terrible crime that I wish I could take back. As much as I look back at the entire military apparatus that I was part of as engaging in criminal activity and in perpetrating occupation and killing civilians and on a large scale, and also setting the stage for much worse crimes that would later occur. Uh, to me, when you read the banality of evil, uh, it was a lot like that. They would give you an assignment like try to figure out where the supermarkets are, where the mosques are, where the waterways are. Try to figure out where there's nurseries and things like that. Um, that was a lot of what I did. Try to figure out what is the structure of the municipalities,
Was this in Gaza,
what
by the way?
no, this is the West Bank. I was in Pikud Merkaz, Central Command. Gaza is part of Southern Command, so I had nothing to do with Gaza.
So I mean,
Oh,
we're seeing some nurseries being tear gassed, in the West Bank. We're seeing, so some of this information that you put together is being used, today for Israel to essentially mete out, acts of violence in the West Bank, right?
well, I don't think any of the information that I put together is still relevant directly, but
It was a
it's
building
it's
block, definitely,
it's a
right?
building block. Absolutely, and that's why I would not serve in the IDF. I don't think the IDF is a legitimate army because, especially in the West Bank, at that time and still today, the main problem with the IDF in the West Bank, yeah, it's a good thing that we brought up this the West Bank and not Gaza. The main problem with the IDF in the West Bank is that it's there only to serve the Jews who live there. It's not in any way meant to serve the Palestinians, who are the vast majority of the population. Then they were an even bigger majority. Well, I don't know. There were less settlers, but there were also less Palestinians. But just a small minority, and that's who you're there to defend. You'd
And
have to defend soldiers.
the resources that are
Settlers.
poured into those areas, to protect a handful of settlers. You've got these, massive attachments of military out there doing that, right?
Yeah, which the military resented, but still did.
Yep.
The military at that time and the settlers were not on good relations. There are much better relations now for obvious reasons. But we still did it. We still did everything to protect them. Um, the entire existence of the military there, the police there, the apparatus there is only to protect the settlers, it used to be hidden to some extent, and now we're seeing it so openly. Like they will help protect settlers while they're raiding Palestinian villages. That's something that didn't happen back then. They will break up funerals of Palestinians which settlers had killed, all that sort of thing. The settlers were already causing a lot of problems back then with terrorism, but nowhere near as much as now. But a lot of that is because we always treated them with kid gloves. We never killed the settlers who did terror attacks against Palestinians. We always killed Palestinians who did settler attacks against settlers.
And we see the
And that seems
reverberation
wrong
of
to
that.
us.
Yeah, we see the reverberation of that today,
Absolutely.
and in these kind of pogroms that are happening in Christian villages and things like that. Just incredible. I mean, some of the most like barbaric looking people on earth. They look like sand people out of bloody Star Wars or something like that. These bloody settlers running around, half drunk on quarts of vodka. Running around the place, these little rat bag, shitty little kids who you just want to clip over the ear hole, slapping old women on the back of the head with sticks, picking olives and things like that. It's really nasty. And Hollywood tried to depict like child soldiers as these kind of these crazy sporadic kids that just act out and start shooting people left, right, and center. And maybe did a good job at creating that image of that fearful image in the minds of the Western audiences. But I tell you what, I've never seen anything that compares to the way that these settler kids go out and about and cause these crimes. And every time they hit someone or knock someone, there's a look in their eyes that they're not quite sure about what they're doing as well. And yeah, it's mind blowing to witness. Look, I know I've had you for a long time, and you're in an American time, but I just want to leave the audience a little bit with another question to you, about
Sure.
this. Like, you saw October 7, you were a zealot for Israel. You saw Al Shifa Hospital, you were a zealot for Israel. You saw, UNRWA funding being withdrawn. You saw the whole bipartisan apparatus of Israel descend on the narratives to try and control this genocide. What took you so long to come to your position? You were witnessing something that was well and truly a genocide. You're already critical of Israel before this kicked off. So what made you hold on for so long? And I think this is more of a message to other people that might be holding on a little bit, and how they could potentially get off this friggin' hell ride and maybe go have a bath in the toilet and think about things a bit, huh?
Look, what really keeps you holding on to this is identity. You If you want to be accepted by the mainstream of Jewish community, you have to say that you're a Zionist. It's a like a protective armor. Yeah, otherwise, you're a traitor. The ideology is that after the Holocaust, you needed to create a state in order to protect Jews, and if you think that Jews should again be defenseless, you're a traitor against the Jewish people, and you turn from being part of the consensus and part of acceptable society to an Uncle Tom, and you're called every single terrible name under the sun. That is a very strong deterrent. And the way it works is you try to hold on to that identity as much as you can and rationalize as much as you can. People don't tell you to hold on to it. In fact, people constantly tell you, just admit you're not a Zionist already. Just admit you're not one of us. And then you try to rationalize why you're still a Zionist. And Zionism has a long tradition of people who oppose a lot of the policies, what some people call liberal Zionists, today liberal Zionist means something a little bit different.
Means Barry
And that
Weiss.
is exactly. So in Israel, Barry Weiss would be considered a centrist. She wouldn't be considered a liberal Zionist. In America, it means something a little bit different. But we had Meretz, we had these sort of parties, and there's a long tradition of that. And it's kind of controlled opposition, especially now. To some extent, it was always controlled opposition, and it allows you to rationalize it. You want to belong in two camps. You want to be part of the civilized world that cares about other human beings and not be a monster, but you also want to be part of the mainstream of Jewish society. And being a liberal Zionist allows you to square that circle in terms of identity. And you can pretend that you're being very reasonable and looking at both sides, and it's a relatively comfortable place to be socially. And it's pretty easy to pursue any position you want in the Middle East, because there's so many different narratives out there that people are shooting out, some of which have no relation to reality, some of which are based partially on reality. You can sort of choose your reality that fits to your social needs. And I became increasingly aware that I was doing that. As the operation in Gaza, which at first I thought was a just operation, then I thought was not a just operation, and then I thought was a war crime, and then I thought was a genocide. Just every month, it just looked worse and worse, and somehow I couldn't keep the cognitive dissonance quiet. And I have a big mouth, and I'm very opinionated. So, and I'm also not averse to documenting my journey, which most people are averse to. Do whether it's been to my detriment or not, I don't know. But I understand the people who cling to it, but they're doing it increasingly for social reasons. And Zionists are creating a increasingly steep price for exit, and they're doing it intentionally. You see some of them doing this, like right now, anti-Zionism is racism campaign, to make it very clear that you're and they call people like me all kinds of names in order to show what will happen to you if you do the same thing. That's a price I think most people are not willing to pay. So I know a lot of people are already in the public eye, and this has something to do with like the APAC conversation we had before. People are already in the public eye. They're scared to do what I did. I think a couple of other people maybe will eventually.
As
But
a good Zionist, you probably should be thinking about doing this as well now. There has to be some kind of pivot. It's untenable completely. So even as a good Zionist, you have to be thinking out a way to have some courage to criticize something that's untenable, that's ultimately destructive to the Zionist project in the more moderate version of a Zionist project, which is now dead. But yeah, I mean, from both sides, it seems to make
they've
sense
killed
now.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They've
And
killed that. Yeah.
the dead river strategy was something that popped up from a professor in China, who essentially said in China they had a strategy in the Han Dynasty where if a general placed his army with a river behind them, essentially they would fight more rather than get pushed into the river, and it would be more effective for the army.
So what is a river for the Israel? Like
Yeah, that's a good question. What's a river right here, right? The river is a taboo, right? What's the worst thing you can do in modern society? Killing children, guys, right? So there's no exit for Israel. You either go all the way or the world comes and destroys you anyway.
And he's essentially saying what Israel has done is put a whole bunch of dead children in their river. And the only way is to go forward, because to go back would be to reckon with the damage that's behind them. So I mean, look, I mean, this is a great insight from yourself, and it's really tough to see bright people, positive young people, who aren't as courageous as yourself, being trapped in this sort of situation. And I often wonder, like, how much. Well, I'm really disappointed with the mums and dads of Israeli and Jewish kids. One of the things here is that supremacy, that the idea that Jews can only hang out with each other, that everyone hates them, that that they can only succeed together. When really that's just not friggin' true. I'm an Irish person whose family was persecuted, throughout the eons, a lot more than modern Jewish people were by the British, pound for pound. And I don't identify with needing to hang out with Irish all the time. In fact, I'm fascinated by other colonial cultures that have suffered under, the same similar situations as Ireland. And I would rather, my family's Irish. The last thing I want to do is hang out with more Irish people all the time. I want to go hang out with people from all walks of life. And I find my life a lot richer for it. And I'm sure you do too. So I think that might be a bit of a kicker, right?
You're actually hitting on an interesting paradox in the whole Zionist lie, which is the whole world hates us, everyone hates us, but all of us who live outside of Israel and are not ultra-Orthodox, probably most of our friends are not Jews. We're all very close to we all know it's not true. We know that there's plenty of anti-Semitism out there, but if there's anything, I think that this current Zionism, its online version, has shown us is that these people go out of their way to look for anti-Semitism, and I think everyone sees it. They look for incidents that aren't there. They take one incident somewhere in the world, turn into a huge thing. They wanted to change a name of a park in Dublin, and everyone's been talking about it for 3 days. Someone wears a Palestinian flag pin on a plane, and that's a big deal. It's ridiculous. They're inventing it, and a lot of people know that they're inventing it, and they're doing it in order to create this kind of dichotomy that isn't really there. And all of us know, maybe some Israelis don't know it. Maybe some Israelis, because in Israel, people around you are Jews, and you don't really know. But anyone abroad knows that it's bullshit. Our friends are not Jews, and they treat us fine. And I've run into anti-Semitism in my life, but not that often. And that's not a major part of our lives. And we're turning it into a bigger and bigger part of society by slaughtering Palestinian children and defending it. I mean, we're only making it worse, but it's still not as big a problem as they're making it.
Was it the whole idea of the big Giga Chad Herzl, idea of what Israel was meant to be, was no longer a victim, was someone that could walk tall and not call upon this victim narrative every time to make its decisions, to actually rub shoulders with the world and survive and realize that you're not made out of glass and you can live in this world. What is the point of it if that nation is just a cauldron for people who are lashing themselves and calling themselves victims, right? I mean, it's a tough one for us to understand, and I'm so happy that you came on the program today, Shaiel, and gave us a big chunk of your time. It was a really great experience having you, and I appreciate it.
That's great questions. I wish more people would ask the deeper background questions and the wider picture questions. You do a great job. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. If you've got any more Yankees or Seppos, as we affectionately like to call them down here, if you've got any, people that could come over and have a chat, send them my way. I'm happy to have a good yarn.
Okay, I will send some people your way. You're a very good interviewer.
Thank you very much, Shaiel, and talk to you soon, mate.
All right. Have a great day.